Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Margot Vance laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Vance's silk gown in front of the board members. The deep red liquid bloomed across the cream fabric like a violent, spreading bruise, the scent of fermented grapes and old money suddenly cloying in the air. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the grand ballroom was the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the wine hitting the polished marble floor. The string quartet at the far end of the hall faltered, their bows hovering over strings as a suffocating silence descended upon the founder's gala. Margot didn't pull back. She tilted the bottle further, her eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction that had been decades in the making. She leaned in close, the sharp, floral sting of her expensive Chanel perfume invading Elena's space. "It's a shame, really," Margot whispered, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding investors. "That dress probably cost you 3 months of whatever pittance you earn playing at being a saint. But then, a stain like you was always going to ruin the silk eventually." Elena stood perfectly still. She felt the cold, sticky weight of the wine soaking through her layers, the fabric clinging to her skin like a shroud. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but she refused to let her hands shake. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at her sister, seeing the jagged edge of Margot's desperation hidden behind that mask of diamond-encrusted arrogance. "You have a little something on your chin, Margot," Elena said, her voice remarkably level. "Bitterness. It doesn't wash out as easily as wine." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Arthur Sterling, the venerable chairman of the board, stepped forward, his silver eyebrows knitted in a mask of profound discomfort. Beside him, Sebastian Vance let out a sharp, jagged bark of a laugh, his fingers fidgeting with the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. He looked at Elena not with sympathy, but with the casual cruelty of a man who viewed his sister as an inconvenient item in a budget he was currently overspending. Now, let's not make a scene," Sebastian said, though his eyes were dancing with the thrill of the humiliation. "Elena, perhaps you should head home. You're dripping on the Persian rugs and those cost more than your apartment." Margot straightened, handing the empty bottle to a stunned waiter without looking at him. She adjusted the lace at her cuffs, the picture of regal composure. "He's right. This event is for the pillars of this family, not the cracks in the foundation. Go back to your blueprints and your dusty restoration projects, Elena. Leave the Vance legacy to those of us who actually know how to wear it." Elena looked around the room. She saw the pity in the eyes of the younger associates and the cold, calculated dismissal in the gazes of the old guard. They were all watching, waiting for her to break, to flee the room in a fit of sobbing histrionics. That was the script Margot had written for her. Instead, Elena reached into her small clutch and pulled out a linen handkerchief. She slowly wiped a stray drop of red from her collarbone, her movements deliberate and calm. As she did, her fingers brushed against the heavy, old-fashioned brass key tucked into the inner lining of her bag, the key Aunt Evie had pressed into her hand only 3 nights ago. "The vault isn't just for gold, Elena," her aunt had hissed, her voice thinned by age but sharpened by a long-held grudge. "It's where the skeletons are kept. And Margot has a graveyard in there." Elena felt the cold metal of the key through the fabric, a secret power that hummed against her hip. She looked at Margot, who was already turning away to charm a group of venture capitalists, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass. Margot thought she had won. She thought this public shaming was the final nail in the coffin of Elena's influence within the firm. "I'll leave," Elena said, loud enough for Arthur Sterling and the others to hear. She caught the chairman's eye, holding it until he was the one to look away. "But before I go, Margot, I should mention, I had a long tea with Aunt Evie this afternoon. She sends her love, and she told me all about the 2018 audit." The change in Margot was instantaneous. It was a micro-flicker, a momentary lapse in the ironclad posture, but Elena saw it. The color didn't leave Margot's face. It seemed to freeze there, her smile becoming a brittle, static thing. Her hand, halfway to reaching for a fresh glass of champagne, paused in midair. Evie is a senile old woman, Margot snapped, though the edge in her voice had lost its smoothness. She doesn't know what she's talking about. She seemed very lucid to me, Elena replied, a small, knowing smile finally touching her lips. In fact, she gave me a few things to look over. I think Julian Reed will find the architectural discrepancies particularly interesting for his next report to the board. Sebastian's smirk vanished. He stepped toward Margot, his reckless bravado replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. The name Julian Reed, the man Margot had spent months trying to discredit, acted like a cold wind through the room. Elena didn't wait for a rebuttal. She turned on her heel, her wine-stained gown trailing behind her like a royal cape of a different color. She walked through the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting before her in a wave of stunned, whispering silence. She could feel Margot's eyes burning into her back, a mixture of fury and the first, faint seeds of genuine panic. As she reached the heavy oak doors of the gala hall, Elena paused. She didn't look back at the glittering lights or the false smiles of the Vance dynasty. She looked down at the red stain on her chest and felt a strange, soaring sense of relief. The war had officially begun, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one who should be afraid. She stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of her own heels clicking against the stone steps with a new, rhythmic authority. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had hesitated to call for weeks. "Julian," she said, her voice as hard as the brass key in her purse. "I'm ready. Let's tear it all down." The next morning, the rain drummed a relentless, hollow rhythm against the skylight of Julian Reed's studio. Elena Vance sat on a stool that creaked under her weight, her fingers tracing the jagged teeth of the brass key she had carried away from the gala. The air here smelled of graphite, old vellum, and the sharp, honest scent of cedar shavings, a world away from the cloying lilies and expensive perfumes that defined her mother's house. She watched Julian as he unrolled a set of yellowed blueprints across a drafting table. He didn't look like a man who belonged in the Vance inner circle, with his rolled-up sleeves and the faint smudge of ink on his jaw. Yet he held the blueprints with more reverence than Margot Vance had ever shown her own daughter. "You're sure about this?" Julian asked, his voice low and steady. He didn't look up, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Once we open this door, Elena, there's no going back to the way things were. Margot will burn the world down before she lets the truth out." "She already tried to burn me," Elena replied, her voice surprisingly calm. She thought of the red wine stain on her dress, the way the guests had snickered as she fled. "She thinks she can humiliate me into submission. She thinks I'm still the girl who hides in the shadows." Her phone vibrated against the wooden table, the harsh buzz cutting through the quiet of the studio. The caller ID flashed a name that made her pulse spike: Margot Vance. Elena didn't answer. She let it go to voicemail, then pressed play on the speaker. "Elena, listen to me very carefully," her mother's voice boomed, cold and sharp as a razor. There was no hint of maternal concern, only the icy authority of a woman used to being obeyed. "You stole a family heirloom from my study. If that brass key is not back on my desk by noon, I will call Arthur Sterling and have him file a police report. I won't have a thief under my roof, daughter or not. Don't test me. You know exactly what I'm capable of." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the threat. Margot wasn't just angry. She was weaponizing the law against her own child to protect a secret she thought was still buried. "She's terrified," Julian muttered, finally looking up. His eyes were dark with a mixture of anger and something that looked like admiration. "She's not calling the police because of the gold value of that key. She's calling them because she knows what it opens." Elena stood, the brass key feeling warm in her palm. "She's right about one thing. I do know what she's capable of. She spent years making me believe Aunt Evelyn was unstable, that she had to be sent away for her own good." "But Evie wasn't sick, Julian. She was a witness." She walked over to the drafting table, her heels clicking against the worn floorboards. She pointed to a section of the blueprints that Julian had highlighted in red, a sub-basement of the Vance estate that appeared in the 1950s records but had been omitted from every modern renovation plan. The heritage auction is in 48 hours, Elena said, her eyes narrowing. It's the biggest night of the year for the Vance dynasty. Margot is planning to sell off the last of the sterling collection to fund Sebastian's latest investment. She thinks she's finally clearing the slate. And instead, we're going to show them what the foundation is actually built on, Julian said, a grim smile touching his lips. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a digital recorder and a stack of bank statements he'd spent the night sourcing. I found the trail, Elena. Sebastian Vance didn't just lose his own money in those offshore accounts. He's been dipping into the trust Margot set up for the local charities. Millions are missing. Elena touched the edge of the bank statements. This was the first piece of the puzzle, the proof that the Vance's charitable legacy was a hollow shell. But the key in her hand was the real weapon. It didn't just open a room. It opened a history Margot had spent 20 years trying to erase. 2 days, Elena whispered, the countdown beginning to echo in her mind. In 48 hours, the whole city will be watching Margot take her bow. I want to make sure she has an audience when the curtain finally falls. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the studio window. The woman staring back didn't look like a victim. She looked like a predator. Call Aunt Evelyn, Elena said, her voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. Tell her it's time to come home. The following afternoon, the air in Julian Reed's restoration studio smelled of cedar shavings and the sharp, metallic tang of old blueprints. It was a grounding scent, a stark contrast to the cloying floral perfumes that usually choked the Vance estate. Julian stood over a drafting table, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms dusted with white plaster. He didn't look like a man who belonged in Margot's curated world of galas and champagne toasts, and that was exactly why Elena trusted him. He tapped a caliper against a set of structural plans for the St. Jude's Community Center, the flagship project of the Vance Foundation. It's worse than the offshore accounts, Elena, he said, his voice low and steady. I've cross-referenced the invoices Sebastian Vance submitted against the actual materials used in the foundation. He billed the charity for reinforced high-grade steel. What's actually in the ground is industrial-grade scrap. Elena felt a cold shiver trace her spine. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough edge of the blueprints. If that building goes up with those materials, it won't stay up, Julian finished. He didn't just steal the money. He traded the safety of 300 families for his gambling debts. Elena pulled the manila envelope from her bag, the weight of the bank statements inside feeling heavier than ever. This was the second piece of the puzzle. Sebastian wasn't just a thief. He was a predator who viewed the city's most vulnerable as a personal ATM. Keep these copies, she said, her voice hardening. I need to ensure that when the truth comes out, there's no room for Margot to claim ignorance. 2 hours later, Elena stepped through the front doors of the Vance mansion. The foyer was a battlefield of anniversary gala preparations. A team of florists was struggling to arrange massive displays of white lilies, the scent so thick it felt like a physical weight. In the center of the chaos stood Margot Vance, draped in a silk robe that cost more than most people earned in a year. Move those to the east wing, Margot snapped, pointing a manicured finger at a trembling assistant. The lighting there is more forgiving. We can't have the centerpieces looking as tired as the guests. She turned as Elena approached, her eyes sweeping over Elena's simple linen trousers and blazer with a look of practiced disdain. There you are. I've had 3 calls from the caterer about the vintage selection. Since you've decided to play at being useful lately, you can handle the wine cellar inventory. I'm actually here to speak with Sebastian, Elena said, keeping her voice level. Margot let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Your brother is busy with the board. He's finalizing the legacy speech for tomorrow night. It's a shame you don't share his dedication to this family's reputation, Elena. Instead, you spend your days lurking in dusty studios with that architect. She spat the word like it was a slur. People like him are tools, Elena. You don't invite the hammer to dinner. You use it and put it back in the shed. The arrogance was a physical heat in the room. Elena watched her mother adjust a diamond brooch, the stone catching the light and throwing cold, sharp reflections across the marble floor. Margot didn't see people. She saw assets and liabilities. "I'll find him myself," Elena said. She found Sebastian in the library, the screech of a silver tray on the marble countertop echoing as he poured himself a heavy measure of scotch. He looked up, a smirk playing on his lips, the same entitled expression he'd worn since they were children. "Ah, the family conscience," Sebastian mocked, gesturing with his glass. "Come to lecture me on the ethics of the Foundation again? Save your breath, Elena. The board loves me. The city loves us. And by this time tomorrow, the Vance name will be untouchable." "I saw the blueprints for St. Jude's, Sebastian," Elena said. The smirk didn't falter, but his grip on the crystal glass tightened. "Blueprints are for builders. I'm a visionary. I move money where it's needed most. If a few tons of steel go missing to cover a temporary shortfall, that's just the cost of doing business." "You call stealing from a children's center business?" Sebastian stepped closer, the smell of expensive peat and arrogance radiating off him. "I call it survival. You've lived in this house your whole life, Elena. You've worn the clothes, eaten the food, and enjoyed the protection of this name. Don't act like you're above the dirt it took to build it." He reached out, flicking the lapel of her blazer. "You're just a passenger. Try to steer the ship, and you'll find out how quickly we can drop you at the next port." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the cold, metallic bite of the key in her pocket, the key to the room Margot had kept locked for 20 years. She thought of the families Julian had mentioned, the ones whose lives were being gambled away for a scotch and a smirk. "Gala starts in 24 hours, Elena said, her voice a calm, chilling whisper that seemed to drop the temperature in the library. "Make sure your speech is perfect, Sebastian. You'll want everyone to remember exactly what you said before the curtain falls." She turned and walked out before he could respond, leaving him standing in the center of his stolen luxury. As she reached the foyer, the heavy oak doors swung open. A woman stood in the threshold, her silhouette framed by the fading afternoon sun. She wore a simple black coat, her silver hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. Margot froze, a vase of lilies slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. The sound of breaking crystal was like a starter pistol. "Evelyn," Margot whispered, the color draining from her face until she looked as pale as the flowers at her feet. Aunt Evelyn stepped into the house, her gaze bypassing Margot and landing directly on Elena. "I got your message," she said, her voice like a bell in the sudden silence of the room. "I believe there's a history lesson overdue in this house." Elena looked at her mother's trembling hands and then at the woman who held the final, devastating truth. The countdown had reached its final day. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy wouldn't just be celebrated, it would be dismantled, piece by crooked piece. The following morning, the breakfast room at the Vance estate felt less like a place for nourishment and more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Margot Vance sat at the head of the mahogany table, her spine a rigid line of practiced elegance. She ignored the platter of poached eggs, focusing instead on the sharp, rhythmic clink of her silver spoon against a porcelain teacup. It was the only sound in the room until Aunt Evelyn set her own cup down with a definitive thud. "The house hasn't changed," Evelyn remarked, her voice carrying the dry rasp of a desert wind. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the heavy velvet drapes that seemed to swallow the morning sun. "Still trying to muffle the world outside, Margot? Or are you just hiding the rot in the walls?" Margot didn't look up. "I see 20 years of exile haven't taught you the value of silence, Evelyn. You were always a guest who overstayed her welcome, even when you lived here." She finally raised her eyes, her gaze flicking over her sister's simple wool coat with a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. "You look like a charity case. It's embarrassing, really. I suppose that's why you've crawled back now, looking for a handout before the gala." Elena Vance watched the exchange from the sideboard, her fingers tightening around the cold, metallic casing of the USB drive hidden in her palm. The weight of it was a comfort, a secret weapon forged from the digital records Julian Reed had helped her recover. She felt a strange, detached calm. The woman at the head of the table, the one who had dictated every breath Elena took for 25 years, suddenly looked fragile. "She didn't crawl back, Mother," Elena said, her voice steady as she stepped toward the table. I invited her. We have a lot to discuss before the guests arrive tomorrow night. Margot's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. Discuss? With a woman who traded her inheritance for a life of insignificance? You're being sentimental, Elena. It's a commoner's trait. I expect you to remember who you are. You are a Vance. Without that name, you are nothing but a girl with a penchant for dusty blueprints and a very replaceable architect. The insult to Julian hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned over the table, the scent of Margot's expensive lavender perfume clashing with the faint, metallic smell of the old keys Evelyn had brought with her. That name is a brand, not a shield, Elena whispered. And brands can be tarnished. You're so busy polishing the crown that you haven't noticed the throne is made of balsa wood. One good shove, Mother, that's all it takes. Margot's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger breaking through her icy facade. Is that a threat? In my own house? It's a structural assessment, Elena replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Sebastian Vance stumbled in, looking disheveled. He smelled faintly of stale gin and desperation. He froze when he saw Evelyn, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. What is she doing here? Margot, you said she was handled. Sit down, Sebastian, Margot snapped, her composure snapping back into place like a trap. She's leaving, as is Elena. They have preparations to make for the gala. After all, it's the last time we'll have to endure this particular brand of family drama. Evelyn stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked over to Elena and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was warm, grounding. The foundations are already gone, Margot. You're just living in the echo. As they walked out of the room, leaving Margot and Sebastian in a suffocating silence, Elena caught sight of the catering trucks pulling into the drive through the window. Workers were already beginning to hoist the massive white tents on the lawn. The Vance Legacy Gala was less than 24 hours away. Elena reached into her pocket and touched the flash drive again. Tomorrow, the lights would be bright, the champagne would be flowing, and the elite of the city would be watching. Margot thought she was preparing for a celebration of power. Elena knew she was setting the stage for an execution. The countdown had moved from days to hours, and for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid of the fire. She was the one holding the match. The evening of the Vance Legacy Gala arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness that seemed to settle over the estate like a shroud. Elena stood before the floor-length mirror in her room, the dark silk of her gown clinging to her frame like a second skin. It was a stark contrast to the ethereal, golden palette Margot had demanded for the evening's theme. Elena didn't want to glow. She wanted to disappear into the shadows until the moment she chose to step out of them. The door to her suite swung open without a knock. Margot marched in, the scent of cloying gardenia perfume trailing behind her like a chemical weapon. She was a vision of calculated perfection in hammered gold, her neck draped in the Vance sapphires, stones that Elena knew were likely the only things left in the family vault that weren't leveraged to the hilt. Margot stopped, her gaze raking over Elena with a sneer that didn't reach her perfectly painted lips. You look like you're heading to a wake, Elena. I told you the theme was radiance. This dark ensemble is a deliberate act of defiance, isn't it? I thought it suited the occasion, Elena replied, her voice level. She reached for her small velvet clutch on the vanity, her fingers brushing against the hard, rectangular edge of the flash drive tucked inside the lining. The contact sent a jolt of cold clarity through her. Margot stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. Listen to me carefully. Tonight is about the survival of this family. Arthur Sterling and the rest of the board are looking for any sign of weakness. You will stand where I tell you will smile when I signal, and you will not, under any circumstances, speak to the press or the donors. You've already done enough damage by entertaining that architect. The entitlement in her mother's voice was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that Elena had spent 24 years trying to please. But as she looked at Margot now, she didn't feel the old familiar guilt. She felt a sharp, crystalline pity. You're so worried about the image, Margot, Elena said softly. You've forgotten that a house needs a floor to stand on, not just a fresh coat of gold paint. Margot's face tightened, the skin around her eyes crinkling in a way that betrayed her rage. Don't you dare lecture me on the foundations of this family. I have bled for this name while you've merely lived off it. Now, get downstairs. The first of the cars are arriving. She turned on her heel, her gold train hissing against the floor like a serpent. Elena waited until the footsteps faded before she took a breath. She pulled her phone from her clutch and saw a single message from Julian. The server patch is holding. The projection system is slaved to the drive. I'm at the north perimeter. Be careful. She didn't reply. She couldn't afford the digital trail. Instead, she tucked the phone away and headed downstairs. The transformation of the Vance grounds was staggering. Massive white tents had been erected across the north lawn, illuminated from within so they glowed like fallen moons against the twilight. The air was thick with the smell of expensive charcoal from the catering pits and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. A string quartet played somewhere near the rose garden, the music competing with the rhythmic crunch-crunch of gravel as a line of black town cars disgorged the city's elite. Elena moved through the crowd like a ghost. She saw Sebastian near the bar, his face flushed and his eyes darting toward the entrance every time a new guest arrived. He was nursing a drink with a trembling hand, looking every bit the desperate man Julian had described. His gambling debts weren't just a secret anymore, they were a ticking clock. "Elena!" a word. She turned to see Arthur Sterling approaching. The chairman of the board looked older than he had a month ago, his silver hair gleaming under the tent's chandeliers. He held a crystal flute of champagne, the bubbles rising in a frantic, tiny stream. "Arthur," she greeted him, "it's a beautiful evening." "It's a performance," Arthur whispered, leaning in close. His breath smelled of expensive cigars and anxiety. "Margot tells me the quarterly reports will be finalized by tomorrow morning. She says the Vance legacy is more secure than ever. Is she telling me the truth, Elena? Because the rumors from the bank are troubling." Elena looked past him to where Margot was holding court with a group of local politicians, her laughter ringing out, bright, brittle, and entirely false. "The truth is a difficult thing to pin down in this house, Arthur," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "But I think you should pay very close attention to the keynote presentation tonight. The numbers will speak for themselves." Arthur's brow furrowed, but before he could press her, Margot was there, sliding a manicured hand onto Arthur's arm. "Arthur, darling, don't let my daughter bore you with her gloom. Come, the mayor is dying to ask you about the harbor redevelopment." She didn't even look at Elena as she led him away, but the squeeze she gave Arthur's arm was firm enough to leave a mark. Elena retreated toward the edge of the tent, near the technical booth. She spotted Julian in the distance, dressed in a waiter's vest, moving through the crowd with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. He caught her eye for a split second, a brief, grounding anchor in the sea of pretension, and gave a microscopic nod toward the main stage. The centerpiece of the tent was a massive high-definition screen, currently looping a montage of the Vance family's historical achievements. Black and white photos of Elena's grandfather breaking ground on the city's first skyscraper, portraits of her father at charity galas, and carefully edited clips of Margot accepting various civic awards. It was a monument to a lie. Aunt Evie appeared beside Elena, her presence as sudden and silent as a shadow. She was dressed in a simple, elegant gray suit that looked entirely out of place among the sequins and silk. "The lions are all in the cage, Elena," Evie whispered, her eyes fixed on the stage. "Margot is about to start her speech. Are you sure you want to do this? There's no coming back from the light." Elena felt the weight of the flash drive in her hand, the cold metal a promise of justice. She thought of the families Julian had seen lose their homes to Sebastian's investments, and the employees Margot had silenced to keep the Vance name pristine. "I'm not looking to come back, Evie," Elena said. "I'm looking to move forward." A chime rang out through the tent, the sound of a silver spoon striking crystal. The quartet stopped playing. The hum of conversation died down as the lights dimmed, leaving only the stage bathed in a brilliant, golden spotlight. Margot Vance stepped up to the microphone, her smile radiant, her posture regal. She looked like a queen presiding over an empire. She had no idea that she was standing on a trapdoor. "Friends, colleagues, and family," Margot began, her voice projected with practiced warmth. "Tonight, we celebrate a century of excellence. Tonight, we look toward a future that is as bright as our past." Elena moved toward the technical console, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw Julian move into position behind the main server rack. The countdown had ended. The match was struck. "But before we look ahead," Margot continued, her eyes finding Arthur Sterling in the front row, "let us look at the strength of our current foundation." Elena reached out and slotted the drive into the master port. "Yes," Elena whispered to the empty air. "Let's." The screen behind Margot Vance didn't just flicker, it screamed. The Century of Excellence slide, with its soft gold hues and corporate polish, vanished in a heartbeat. In its place appeared a stark, high-resolution scan of a private ledger, the Vance Legacy Trust's official seal visible at the top. The hum of the projector was the only sound in the room for 3 agonizing seconds as the audience processed the rows of red numbers. Elena Vance stood in the shadows of the technical booth, her fingers still resting on the cool plastic of the master drive. She could smell the faint scent of ozone and heated electronics, a sharp contrast to the suffocating aroma of expensive lilies wafting from the stage. She watched her mother, who was still smiling at the front row, unaware that her empire had just been replaced by a confession. "As I was saying," Margot continued, her voice projecting with practiced warmth, "the foundation of this family is unshakable." A ripple of hushed gasps broke the silence. Arthur Sterling, the family's oldest investor, leaned forward, his silver brows knitting together into a lethal line of confusion. He adjusted his glasses, staring at the screen where a wire transfer for $7 million was highlighted in neon yellow. The recipient wasn't a charity or a restoration project. It was a debt consolidation firm specializing in high-stakes gambling arrears. Margot finally turned. The blood didn't just leave her face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving her skin the color of wet ash. Her perfectly lined lips parted, trembling, as the predatory grace she'd worn like armor for decades shattered in an instant. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, went wide and glassy, darting across the room as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. The regal tilt of her chin vanished, replaced by a pathetic, involuntary tremor that made her pearls clatter against her throat. She looked less like a queen and more like a ghost haunted by her own signature. "There seems to be a technical glitch," Margot hissed, her voice cracking as she glared toward the wings. "Someone fix the damn screen before I have you blacklisted from every venue in the city." She was still trying to command a room that was already turning its back on her. Sebastian Vance, standing near the bar with a glass of vintage scotch, let the crystal slip from his hand. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound like a gunshot in the vacuum of the ballroom. He stared at his own name on the screen, listed as the primary beneficiary of the unauthorized disbursements. "This is a fabrication," Margot shouted, her eyes finally locking onto Elena in the darkness. She pointed a shaking finger. "This is the work of a disgruntled, jealous girl. Elena, how dare you try to sabotage your own mother's legacy with these lies?" The board members didn't look at Elena. They looked at the signatures. They looked at the dates. Julian Reed stepped out from behind the server rack, his face a mask of stoic calm as he handed a physical folder to Arthur Sterling. "The digital records are mirrored in the physical audits, Arthur," Julian said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "Every dollar meant for the historic district was diverted to cover Sebastian's losses in Macau, authorized by the CEO herself." The room erupted. The socialites who had spent the evening fawning over Margot now physically recoiled, shifting their chairs back as if her disgrace were contagious. The CFO was already on her phone, her face grim, likely calling the firm's legal counsel. Elena stepped out of the booth and walked slowly toward the stage. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply stopped at the edge of the golden spotlight, looking up at the woman who had spent a lifetime making her feel small. "You told me once that I didn't belong in this world because I didn't understand the cost of maintaining it," Elena said, her voice steady and cold as ice. "I finally understand, Margot. The cost was your soul, and tonight the bill is due." Margot reached out, perhaps to strike her or perhaps to plead, but Arthur Sterling stood up, his cane striking the floor with a heavy, final thud. "Don't," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a disgust that was far more damaging than any scream. "You've said quite enough, Margot. Security will see you to the door. We'll discuss the criminal charges in the morning." Elena didn't wait to see the guards take her mother's arm. She didn't wait to hear Sebastian's frantic excuses or see the board's formal vote to strip the Vance name from the building. She turned her back on the stage, on the lights, and on the wreckage of a century of lies. She walked through the heavy oak doors and out into the cool, night air, leaving the sound of her mother's crumbling world behind her. She had the evidence. She had the truth. And for the first time in her life, she had the keys to a future that didn't belong to anyone but herself. Behind her, the gala was still in chaos, but as Elena reached the sidewalk, she didn't look back. The countdown had ended, and the explosion was exactly as silent as she had hoped. 10 minutes had passed since the lights in the ballroom had flickered and died, but for Elena, the world was only just beginning to come into focus. She stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, the sharp scent of damp concrete and ozone filling her lungs, a stark contrast to the cloying lilies and expensive perfumes of the gala. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the Vance estate creaked open again. She didn't have to turn to know who was there. The frantic, uneven click of designer heels on the marble steps was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "Elena, you stop right this instant." Margot Vance stumbled into the light of the street lamps, her silk gown stained and her perfectly coiffed hair beginning to unravel in the mist. She looked like a creature dragged out of a shipwreck, clutching a clutch bag as if it were a life preserver. Behind her, Arthur Sterling emerged, followed by 2 members of the board and a pale, trembling Sebastian. "It's a forgery," Margot hissed, her voice cracking as she reached the bottom step. She turned to Arthur, her eyes wide and wild. "You saw it, Arthur." "My daughter has been influenced by that architect. She's trying to steal what my husband built. Tell her it's impossible." Arthur didn't look at Margot. He looked at the folder Elena still held against her side, then back at the woman he had represented for 30 years. He adjusted his glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses and hiding his expression. "I've spent the last 10 minutes reviewing the digital signatures on the cloud server, Margot. The documents Elena presented aren't just authentic. They were filed and notarized by your husband 3 weeks before his passing. The transfer of the controlling interest was never meant to be triggered until tonight." Margot's face didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The carefully curated mask of the Vance matriarch, held in place by decades of expensive serums and even more expensive lies, buckled. Her eyes, usually as sharp and cold as flint, became watery and unfocused, darting around the foyer like trapped birds. The skin around her mouth grayed, a ghostly pallor creeping up from her throat to her hairline until she looked less like a socialite and more like a marble statue left out in the rain. Her lower lip trembled, a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed the sudden, violent loss of the only thing she ever loved, her shadow kingdom. The regal tilt of her chin vanished, replaced by a sagging, heavy defeat that made her look 20 years older in a single heartbeat. "No," Margot whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of city traffic. "He wouldn't. He loved me." "He loved the truth," Elena said, stepping forward. She felt the cold weight of the brass key in her pocket, the key to the safe deposit box Aunt Evelyn had told her about. "And he knew you'd burn the world down before you let anyone else lead. You didn't just lie to the board, Mother, you lied to him." Sebastian took a tentative step toward Elena, his hands shoved deep into his tuxedo pockets. "Elena, look, we can talk about this. The gambling debts. They were a mistake. We're family. We can fix the Vance name together. If you just tell the board you made a mistake with the percentages." "A mistake?" Elena cut him off, her gaze shifting to her brother. "You sat there and watched her humiliate me for years. You let her treat Julian like dirt because it kept the spotlight off your own failures. You aren't worried about the family, Sebastian. You're worried about your allowance." The two board members exchanged a sharp look. One of them, a woman who had been Margot's closest confidant for a decade, took a deliberate step away from the matriarch. "Margot, I think it's best if you don't come into the office tomorrow. We'll need to conduct a full internal audit of the charitable trust." "An audit?" Margot gasped, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers brushing against a diamond necklace that suddenly looked like a noose. "I am this company." "You were the face of it," Arthur said, his tone professional and utterly devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for her. "But the bones belong to Elena now, and she has made it very clear that your services are no longer required." A black town car pulled up to the curb, its tires splashing through a puddle. The driver stepped out, holding an umbrella, but he didn't move toward Margot. He moved toward Elena. "Your car is ready, Ms. Vance," he said. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Margot's ragged breathing. She looked at the board members, then at Arthur, searching for a single spark of loyalty. She found nothing but the cold, hard stare of people who had finally seen behind the curtain. Even the waitstaff, hovering near the open doors, were watching with a grim, silent satisfaction. "You told me I was a guest in this life," Elena said, her voice a calm blade that cut through the night. "You told me I didn't belong in this house or at that table, but you were the one squatting in mine. The locks are already being changed, Mother. Sebastian's accounts are frozen. You have until noon tomorrow to have your personal items cleared out of the estate." "You can't do this," Margot wailed, a thin, desperate sound. "I have nowhere to go." "Call Aunt Evelyn," Elena suggested, her hand on the car door. "I'm sure she has plenty to say to you." Elena slid into the back seat, the leather cool and smelling of cedar. As the car pulled away, she looked through the rear window. Margot was left standing on the sidewalk, a small, shivering figure illuminated by the harsh white light of the street lamps, clutching a bag full of nothing while the empire she had built on lies finally turned to dust. Elena leaned back and closed her eyes, the key in her pocket feeling lighter with every mile they put between her and the wreckage. She was free, but as the city lights blurred past, she knew the hardest part wasn't the winning. It was figuring out who she was now that she didn't have to fight to exist. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the Vance estate had swung shut for the last time, and for Elena, the world finally had a different scent. It no longer smelled of stagnant lilies and floor wax, but of roasted coffee, fresh ink, and the sharp, clean tang of autumn air. She stood in the center of a sun-drenched studio in the city's historic district, the brick walls stripped bare and the drafting tables cluttered with blueprints. It wasn't a palace, but it was hers. Julian Reed stood by the window, his sleeves rolled up as he examined a scale model of their latest project, a low-income housing complex designed with the same dignity and detail he once gave to mansions. He looked up and caught her eye, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The quiet ease between them was a wealth Elena Vance had never known existed. The morning peace was shattered by the rhythmic, hollow click of a loose heel against the hardwood floor. Elena didn't need to turn around to know the cadence of that walk, though it was slower now, lacking its former predatory grace. Margot Vance stood in the doorway, and for a moment, the room seemed to turn cold. She was wearing a tailored black coat that had once cost a fortune, but the hem was frayed, and a faint, stubborn stain marred the lapel. Her hair, usually a silver helmet of perfection, was brittle and unevenly dyed. She clutched a designer handbag that looked far too heavy for her thin arm, a relic of a life that had been stripped away piece by piece. "You look well, Elena," Margot said. Her voice still carried that sharp, aristocratic edge, but it trembled at the margins. "I am well," Elena replied. She kept her voice level, devoid of the heat that used to rise in her throat whenever her mother entered a room. She didn't offer a chair. She didn't offer tea. She simply stood her ground, the weight of her own accomplishments acting as an invisible shield. Margot stepped further into the room, her eyes darting over the modest furniture with a flicker of the old disdain. This place. It's a bit cramped, isn't it? Hardly the environment for a woman of your lineage. I've been speaking with Arthur Sterling. He mentioned that the foundation Aunt Evelyn set up has a surplus this quarter. Elena felt a familiar prickle of irritation, the first rage spike of the morning. Even after the public disgrace, after the bank accounts were frozen and the social invitations dried up, Margot was still hunting for a loophole. She was still looking for a way to live off the labor of the people she had spent a lifetime looking down upon. The foundation funds are for the community center and the preservation of the estate's gardens for public use, Elena said firmly. Not for your personal maintenance. I am the reason there is an estate to preserve. Margot's voice rose, the entitlement flaring like a dying ember. I gave 40 years to that name. I protected it. And now I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where the sirens never stop. Sebastian is in a state-mandated program, and you're playing architect with a man who should have been your employee. She cast a vitriolic look toward Julian, but he didn't flinch. He simply crossed his arms, his presence a silent, steady anchor for Elena. You didn't protect the name, Margot, Elena said, stepping closer. She noticed the smell then, not the expensive French perfume Margot used to favor, but the faint, medicinal scent of cheap soap and old wool. It was the smell of a woman who had been forced to do her own laundry for the first time in her life. You protected a facade. You destroyed the family to save the wallpaper. Margot's face contorted, her mouth opening to deliver a retort that would have once cut Elena to the bone. But the words died in her throat. She looked at Elena and saw someone she didn't recognize, a woman who wasn't waiting for approval, who wasn't afraid of a sharp tongue. I'm here because I need a stipend, Margot finally whispered, the arrogance collapsing into a desperate, raw plea. Proportional to what I lost. It's only fair, Elena, after everything I did for you. Fairness is exactly what you received, Elena replied. Aunt Evelyn provides you with a safe place to live and a modest allowance. That is more than you gave me when you tried to sign away my future. Elena reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small, silver key. It was the key to the estate's private archives, something she had kept to ensure the family's true history, the debts, the lies, and the triumphs, was documented correctly. She set it on the table. If you want more, you can work for it. The foundation needs a docent for the historical tour. You know the history better than anyone, but you'll wear the uniform and you'll follow the schedule. The silence in the room was absolute. Margot stared at the key as if it were a poisonous insect. The idea of serving the public in her own former home was the ultimate face slap, a karmic inversion she couldn't seem to process. Her hands shook as she gripped her purse. You're cruel, Margot hissed, though there was no power behind it. No, Elena said, turning back to her drafting table. I'm just a Vance who finally learned the value of an honest day's work. Julian, could you show her out? We have a deadline. Margot stood frozen for a second, a ghost in a frayed coat, before she turned and fled the office. The sound of her limping heel faded down the hallway, replaced by the steady hum of the city outside. Elena leaned against the table, the adrenaline fading into a quiet, bittersweet ache. She had won. She had the career, the man, and the freedom she had craved. But as she looked at the empty doorway, she felt the weight of the cost. She had lost a mother she never truly had, and she had buried a legacy that had been built on sand. Julian walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. You okay? Elena looked at the blueprints, then at her own steady hands. I'm fine, she said, and for the first time she knew it was the truth. The wreckage is cleared. Now we just build.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.